It's always fun to watch movies and see flubs, like someone wearing a watch in Spartacus or a coffee cup in Game of Thrones. And I've taken to watching a series on Netflix called Stranger Things. Kind of interesting, science fiction-y. And there's a scene in there where one of the young boys pours out a handful of M&Ms. And interestingly enough, when he pours out those M&Ms, there were all kinds of colors there, including some red ones. Now, what is the story about that? The story is that when this supposedly took place, which was in the 1980s, there were no red M&Ms. And the reason was that the US Food and Drug Administration had banned the use of red dye number 2. Although M&Ms had never used this dye, they were afraid people would want to avoid all red colorants. So they decided the world could do without red M&Ms. Red dye number 2 had been approved way back in 1906. And there were a number of dyes that were approved, including red dye number 2. And no one thought that there was any problem with this synthetic dye until the 1970s, when some Soviet studies showed that this was toxic in Soviet rats. Well, American scientists looked at this and said, what do the Soviets know about red? And they dismissed the studies, which actually were not very well done. But then the FDA commissioned a few studies which showed that this red dye number 2 did cause some problems in American rats as well. And then they decided, just to be on the safe side, that red dye number 2 was going to be banned. And it was replaced by red dye number 40, which interestingly enough at that time was already banned in Europe. So there was a lot of controversy about this, about why this was banned. And even before the internet, there were all kinds of pseudoscience explanations floating around. For example, that workers were stealing the red M&Ms off the assembly line because they were aphrodisiacs, and that's why the red disappeared. So no, that is not true. In the US, red dye number 2 is still not allowed. Canada never banned it because our government never thought that the information was sufficient to cause a ban. So we have both red dye number 2, red dye number 40. In the US, they use red dye number 40. In England, where they don't have red dye number 40, they use cochineal extract in the red M&Ms. So there are all of these interesting stories. The fact is that there is no big problem with any of these dyes when they're consumed in proper amounts. I mean, no one should be eating bagfuls of M&Ms every day. It is a condiment. You eat a few of them because you like them. Now, the story about the red dye being an aphrodisiac. No, there is nothing to that. But recently, some people have suggested that it's the blue that's the issue here, that maybe the blue does stimulate some romantic interests. So, I don't know. I do have one of my little M&M dispensers here. Let's just see what I'm going to get. Blue.